Hey guys, welcome back to the Guilty as Charged podcast. Alex and I are so happy to be joined today by the Athletics' Robert Mays. You can find him on Twitter at Robert Mays and on the Athletic Football Show podcast, which is fantastic. If you've been following me, you've probably seen me talk about it already. So Robert, thanks for joining us today, man. How you doing?
I'm good. Happy to be here. Appreciate you guys having me.
So obviously, if people have been listening to your guys' podcast, you've heard you guys talk about, Brandon Staley and Justin Herbert quite a bit so far this offseason, which has been great for us because normally it's, as Charger fans, we get, the Chargers are dark horse Super Bowl contenders conversation in April and then nothing for the summer. So it's been fun listening to your guys' conversation. You recently interviewed Brandon Staley. What was kind of your main takeaway from talking to him? Because you had talked to him before when he was an assistant, but now that he was the head coach of the Chargers, what was your main takeaway or two from interviewing him as the head coach of the Chargers?
I really liked what he said about building the offense around Justin Herbert, not just around his skill set, but kind of making him the offense where the quarterback becomes the system. I thought that was a really interesting insight because he comes from a place where the offensive coordinator, the play caller, was the offense. Sean McVay was the one pulling the levers. He was the one that was definitely in command of that. And you kind of, I think, I want to say it was Daniel Jeremiah or Sage Rosenfeld said this to me once about Kyle Shanahan. Kyle Shanahan wants to have the controller in his hand, right? He wants to be the one with the joystick. And I think that Sean McVay in LA was very similar to that. And they don't want that situation to happen with the Chargers. They want Justin Herbert to have more control and have him be the one that's pressing all the buttons. And I thought that was a really interesting and important insight because that's the issue, right? When you have an offensive coordinator that's the one in command, if you lose that guy, you lose your offense. You lose what makes you good, what made that guy attractive in the first place. And it just doesn't feel like the Chargers are going to allow that to happen on several different levels. And I thought that was really smart because I've said multiple times, I just think that hiring an offensive-minded head coach is safer. It's a safer way to continue to sustain success because you need to be good offensively pretty much every single year to be good in the NFL. And if you have a defensive-minded head coach, the moment you have a good offensive coordinator, that guy can leave. And now what are you going to do? So right. I think insulating yourself from that eventuality or that option is really smart. And I think that's just another example of how he's thinking a couple steps ahead with things like this, which I find very impressive.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned kind of the offense-defense debate. That was certainly a debate in the Chargers offseason. You had a coach like Brian Daboll, who seemed like a favorite to get the job, and then they hire Brandon Staley. And so that kind of created these two camps. They have to go offense to develop Justin Herbert and keep going in that direction, or do they boost the defense, right? So that was kind of the debate that Chargers fans got into these two camps. Where did you sort of fall in that debate? I mean, you kind of already said it, but how has that changed in the last 6 months and, after speaking to Brandon Staley?
When the idea that Brian Daboll was the favorite kind of emerged, I was excited about that as somebody who wanted to see Justin Herbert develop. I mean, you can see it, right? You can see what happened with Josh Allen, and I think that should make any Chargers fan excited. If they were going to go with a defensive-minded head coach, I think this is the one I would want them to go with if I were a Chargers fan, just because I do think that he's a really interesting case, right? I mean, he said to me, I'm a quarterback that happens to coach defense. And I just think some of the things that he's done and some of the specifics of his background and everything else, I'm intrigued to see what he does. So if they were going to go with a defensive-minded head coach, I think this is the only route I would have been supportive of if I were a Chargers fan. So I would definitely be excited about it, even if it is a little bit counterintuitive and a little bit antithetical to what some Chargers fans wanted out of this process.
Well, it's interesting because as Chargers fans, we should know by now that if someone's not being talked about, that's probably who the person is going to be selected. There was too much stock in Brian Daboll, and unfortunately, I personally fell victim to that, but it's all good. We live and we learn. I like you guys, I love learning about like defensive trends and offensive trends, and I think you guys did a really fantastic job on recently kind of outlining those things. And I think it might have been Nate Tice who pointed out, the Vic Fangio defense has kind of been slow rolling. Like it's been a while, like not many other teams are doing this kind of thing. Do you think Brandon Staley is going to be able to kind of take that torch and maybe become a trendsetter in the NFL?
I think it's already happened. If you look at some of the moves that have happened over the last few months, I mean, we have some proliferation of that system in a way that it never really happened with Vic Fangio. I mean, Sean Desai was on the staff with Vic Fangio in Chicago. He's now the defensive coordinator for the Bears. Joe Barry was with Brandon Staley in LA last year. He's now the coordinator for the Packers. Aubrey Pleasant, who was on the staff with Brandon Staley in LA last year, is now the passing game coordinator for the Lions. So I think some of these ideas are traveling and becoming a little bit more widespread than you already would have assumed, because they're going to run them with the Chargers. And my understanding is that even though Raheem Morris is now the defensive coordinator for the Rams, they're going to carry over a lot of those ideas. So if you look at just structurally how defenses in the NFL worked last season, if you look at a chart, for example, of how many teams are playing a too high shell on early downs, it's really just the chart. It was really just the Rams and the Broncos in their own quadrant of that graph. Right. Now, let's say that there are 6 teams in that quadrant. It's literally 3 times as many. Now you have a quarter of the league. Like, that's a monumental shift, even if it doesn't seem like it's that many more teams poaching these ideas. So we'll see what happens with this year, and we'll see if some more success from Brandon Staley and these concepts make it proliferate even further. But I already think it's happened in a way that it never happened before.
I sort of wanted to ask what you think about sort of the use of linebackers maybe in that second level of the defense, because I feel like almost in romantic, explicit detail, Brandon Staley gave you so much about the first, the third level, how many times he's meeting per week with his defensive line and the secondary. And the Chargers are a team that spent a first-round pick on a guy like Kenneth Murray a year ago, and the Rams didn't really feature their linebackers a lot. I mean, you had Micah Kaiser, but I don't think he was a playmaker in the same way some of the other guys on that defense were used to be. So what do you sort of think the plan is for them? Are they just sort of supposed to go with the motion of the game, or do you think that they'll be kind of used more in positions that help them succeed?
I think the Rams' lack of linebacker usage is more an indication of the Rams' linebacker talent and not of the value system that Brandon Staley has. So if you have a team with better linebackers, you're going to see more linebackers. The Rams had better talent on the back end. And if you can get the best pass defenders on the field consistently, that's what he was going to do. I think that last year, Staley and the Rams staff was looking for as many excuses as possible to get their linebackers out of pass defense situations. This year, that may not have to happen. So I think you're going to see a very different approach in a lot of ways with this Chargers defense compared to what we saw with the Rams last year. One, because the personnel was drastically different, and I think that you have to build around it in that way. 2, he knows he has to do things differently. You can't just stay stagnant. You can't just do the same things over again. And I think that that's one of his challenges this year. And I think that that's what really good offensive football coaches consistently do. Guys I've talked to that have had sustained success in the NFL or that have staved off regression in impressive ways. Their staffs consistently talk about how they're trying to innovate, how they're trying to find the change up to their fastball. And I think that's exactly the process that he's tried to undergo here over the last few months.
Yeah, and to your point, when he got to Chicago, he had Roquan Smith and Danny Trevathan, and those 2 guys, are very good playmakers. So I kind of want to shift gears a little bit to the Justin Herbert conversation. I'll kind of blend the 2 here. What do you think it was about the Saints specifically, like the Saints offense, that drew Brandon Staley to kind of pair that offense with Justin Herbert? Because, he ran a little bit of the Shanahan system last year, and that was kind of, everybody wanted him in, a big Shanahan offense if they could have had the chance. But, going towards this offense seemed to be a little bit of a shift that not a lot of people were discussing when it comes to fits for Justin Herbert. So you studying Herbert, you've been studying the offensive trends. What do you like about pairing him with that Saints offense?
So I know that the Shanahan offense has become kind of the offense du jour in the NFL, right? I mean, a lot of people are adopting that system and hiring off that tree. But when you talk to people in the NFL, I remember specifically at a conversation, I don't think he'd mind me saying this. I remember specifically last year, I was talking to Matt LaFleur about something. And we were discussing just when you study, what you study and why, and how you spend your time in the off season. And he talked about the fact that he was studying the Saints offense, and everyone does. Yearly, annually in the NFL, people watch the Saints. You go through all of the best offenses in the league, and the Saints are consistently an offense that other play callers in the league watch, even if we don't talk about it as much because people don't get poached from there, because good for Sean Payton on making it. I'm actually reading Jeff Duncan's book about Sean Payton and Drew Brees, and it's really interesting some of the things that Payton apparently does to make life better for his assistants. Like, he treats them extremely well, and all of this other stuff. They've done an incredible job of retaining their coaching staff. So that group has stayed intact. So we don't talk about people stealing those ideas as much, but everyone in the league studies that team and tries to find insight into what they're doing offensively. So I think it makes sense to look there, even if it doesn't seem apparent right on its face. And I think the reason that it makes sense is, I think what has made Brandon Staley successful, and what has kind of defined his tenure as a defensive coordinator last year, is he did things that made sense. And that may seem obvious, but he wasn't fighting the tide. He wasn't fighting uphill. It was, this is going to make it harder for teams to create explosive plays against us. Let's do that. The Saints offense at its simplest level is just hard to defend, with all of the different personnel groupings, with all of the different formations, with all of the layers of complexity that they kind of pound on top of their baseline offense. They're just hard to defend. They're hard to prepare for. And again, that may seem simple, but I think at the baseline level, that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to get an offense that was really, really hard to defend as a defensive coordinator. And that's exactly what I think the Chargers are going to try to beat. Because if you look at the Shanahan offenses, there are some, Kyle Shanahan uses a ton of personnel groupings, right? And a lot of different formations, but there aren't that many plays. Like, there are a lot of just baseline plays and little wrinkles off those plays. It's not the thickest playbook in the world. The Saints playbook is like 10,000 pages long. So I can completely understand why, as a defensive coordinator, you just think the prep and the work that has to go into defending that offense is the biggest lift, and why that would make a lot of sense as your choice as a defensive-minded head coach.
Yeah, and going back to the offensive coordinators, you brought up Kyle Shanahan specifically. Do you think that shift towards, we're just going to put this in the hands of the quarterback primarily, with Justin Herbert, with a lot of these guys coming into the league, is that something that's going to spread? I guess that will depend on the success of it. And also, just kind of a follow-up to that, like, why hasn't it happened yet? Because we have all these guys that sort of have all the most physical ability that we've seen out of NFL quarterbacks in years. And it just feels like it's been still kind of based in the OC up until now. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's just a product of the fact that the Shanahan offense gets the most out of its quarterbacks, and it can lift average quarterbacks into being functional guys, right? I think that's a big part of it, is that if there's an offensive system that can elevate its quarterbacks consistently over and over and over again, that's going to take over. But if your quarterback can do more, if your quarterback is capable of being more than just a trigger man and a point and shoot type of guy, then you can go with a different sort of approach offensively. Like, the Browns don't ask Baker Mayfield to do a lot at the line of scrimmage. He's got some cans and he's got some run passes, but there isn't a lot of control. And I can understand why the Chargers would look at somebody like Justin Herbert, who is incredibly smart. His football acumen is apparently very, very good, and say, we can give him however much we want to. We don't have to limit him. So the Shanahan offense is a cheat code and just the path of least resistance with most quarterbacks in the league. But if you can put more on your guy, like Josh Allen is a really good example. Josh Allen is really smart. Josh Allen is a very, very smart person in a way that it surprises some people, because he's a little big and it's kind of a big goof when he plays, but he's actually very smart. And they put a ton on him with protections and everything else. So if you can do that, then why not do that? So I feel like that's the direction that the Chargers are trending in.
Yeah, I think that's going to be fascinating to watch. And, one of my favorite conversations in podcast episodes from you guys is when you did that, the quarterback draft episode. And I was curious, obviously, as a Chargers fan, to see where Justin Herbert would end up. You took him before Josh Allen. What was kind of your confidence level heading into that? And hey, I'm going to take Justin Herbert here. And, everybody's kind of talking about the sophomore slump. It doesn't seem like you think that's going to be an issue.
I don't. And maybe I'm wrong about this. And I completely understand the efficiency under pressure numbers and how that stuff comes back to earth. And I get that. I totally understand that. But I went back and I watched 3 games from the second half of the season before we did that podcast. And I expected to be less enthused about Justin Herbert than I remembered being at the end of the season. You know, when you do some forensics on something, you really look at it up close. It's like, oh, this isn't as shiny as I thought it was.
Yeah.
And I thought the opposite. I went back and I think I watched the Bronco game, the Raiders game, and one more game in the back half of the year. And I was more impressed than I was at the end of last season, just in some of the specifics and just the way he navigates the pocket and some of the downfield accuracy and how he can place balls to every level of the field. And even if the efficiency under pressure comes back to earth a little bit, he was a rookie quarterback last year in terrible circumstances. I mean, they had the worst offensive line in the league, arguably. The weapons are fine, right? But Austin Eckler missed half the year. And then you have Keenan Allen and banged up guys. Like, are we going to pretend that Jalen Guyton is somebody that they were going to count on coming into last season? I think it worked out really well. The amount of speed they had really worked to his benefit. If you just think about some of the deeper concepts that they could throw. I mean, that touchdown he threw against the Bucs, there's like one other quarterback, in my opinion, on planet Earth that probably, maybe 2, maybe Allen and Mahomes in their current iteration could make that throw. That's a special type of arm talent. So that speed works, even if it's just raw speed and not much else. But I just think that I think we expect so much of these guys early on. And even if your performance in a clean pocket and when situation is a little bit more ideal is stickier moving forward, it's not as if he was bad there last year and it was his first season. Right. So I just think even if the pressure numbers come down to earth a little bit, and even if we don't see that ridiculous play under fire and when the pocket is closing in and everything else, he's going to be better in other areas of the game. I'm just betting on the talent. I'm betting on the talent and everything else that we've heard about the guy between the ears. I just think that when I watch him play, even if there are some things that are going to be a little bit wonky with his numbers and it's harder to sustain and all of that stuff, I just truly believe in the bundle of abilities that he has moving forward. And I know I picked him ahead of Josh Allen in that draft, and it's for a couple different reasons. One, this is a contract, right? Yeah. I mean, if we're going into year 2, you still have 3 more cheap years of this guy. And that is, let's say he's really good this year. And which I believe he could be. And you roll in as the Chargers to next offseason. And Mike Williams is now not under contract for $15 million. The cap goes back up to 208. I mean, you could be rolling with some real dough next year and try to make a push for this thing with Justin Herbert as your quarterback, which I think is an advantage. I also anticipated that Josh Allen would go earlier in the draft, and I had made up my mind when I was taking Justin Herbert at that spot. So there are a couple of different kind of considering factors here.
Yeah, and I think we talk about the roster and how good on paper it looks every year, right? Steven mentioned kind of the preseason hype that the Chargers get a lot of the time. And something that's affected that in previous years has been injuries. I mean, injuries have just been such a devastating blow, whether it was Derwin James last year, obviously, Joey Bosa had to miss some games. What do you kind of make of the Chargers' depth at this point? I know you posted that GIF, no question about it. I'm ready to get hurt again a couple months ago. What do you kind of make of their depth? And is this a team that maybe a little bit smarter about injuries now that they have the whole sports performance angle and Staley is the head coach? Or, are they just kind of one, piece away from being what they were in previous years?
I think the depth is concerning at certain parts of the roster, right? Like you need some breaks to go your way. Like let's say the Asante Samuel Jr. ends up starting as your other outside corner and that piece falls into place. But there's not a lot of depth in the secondary. If they get banged up in that area, it becomes a problem in a hurry. Up front, there's not a lot of depth, period. I mean, it's like there just aren't that many guys in the front 7. If they get hurt, they're in trouble. And that's why I think that if I were lining them up with the best rosters in the AFC, the true contenders in the AFC, I just think their range of outcomes is wider than a team like the Browns. Because if Greg Newsome gets hurt in week 1, then Greedy Williams just becomes your third corner. It's just, they have so much depth at important areas that the Chargers just don't have. So I think the Chargers' best case scenario I think it's right there. I mean, maybe a notch down from the Chiefs and the Bills and the Browns, but I think in the same neighborhood. But I also think their floor is much, much lower just because the depth isn't there and there's so much more uncertainty. But I think the sports performance side of this, and I think offensively it's the same way, right? I mean, like you have aging players. Bulaga's been consistently hurt. You're relying on a rookie left tackle. It's just a more fragile situation than it is in some other places, even if I'm excited about it. And I think the sports performance side is a really interesting point to bring up. Injuries are not consistent from season to season for the most part, except in two very specific situations. The Chargers are always hurt, and the Rams are never hurt. The Rams have led the league or been in the top 5 in adjusted games lost pretty much every single year over the last 5 or 6 years. And maybe there's something that they're doing. They have locked into something sports performance wise that has allowed them to avoid some of that stuff. And if you look at the ways they've treated the preseason, when they've rested guys, Andrew Whitworth getting a lot of time off. And I think that's something really interesting that Staley mentioned to me during the podcast about how, as an NFL head coach, you can't treat everybody the same. There are guys that are my age and getting into their mid 30s on that team. Those guys shouldn't be pushed as hard or practice in the same way that Asante Samuel Jr. or Rashawn Slater should be. And I just think understanding that and giving your guys the best chance to succeed and using all of the available information is a smart process. It's the right way to go about this.
Yeah. And if he can have that, if he can bring that same kind of mentality and performance to Brian Bulaga, like, this team's ceiling is that much better because we've kind of joked a little bit about, the backups on the offensive line. Granted, the starters are better, but the backups are definitely concerning in a lot of those areas. So this has been great. This is the last question that I will ask today. And then, we'll have the ending of the conversation, obviously. And so gun to your head, Robert, what's the record for the Chargers team going this year? Like if you had to make a prediction, you mentioned the ceiling, you mentioned the floor, where do you kind of land on predicting where this team ends up?
10-7. That's my like safe proclamation here. I think they are a borderline playoff team who ends up finishing second in their division to Kansas City.
Yeah, that's kind of how we have felt as well. So I still feel like you mentioned next offseason feels like the big push. We'll see what happens with Mike Williams. Joe Lombardi thinks Mike Williams is going to have a huge season, so we'll have to see about that one. But Robert, this has been great, man. Where can our listeners find the podcast and find you guys on Twitter? And you've had some great summer projects so far, but what do you guys have coming up in the future?
So our off-season interview series on the Athletic Football Show, which you can find wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, all of that stuff. We had Chris Ballard on today. The Colts GM will have another GM on next week. So we've had, I think, 4 GMs, a couple head coaches, including Brandon Staley. It's been fun. Scheduling it has been the bane of my existence for the last 3 months, but the actual end product has been enjoyable. And we're going to have, I think, 2 podcasts next week, one, the last interview, and then one more show. And then after that, we're going to do 1 a week for the following 2 weeks before camp. And then camp starts. And I am living out of a suitcase from July 27th through August 15th. I'm going all around the country. We will be at camps. We'll have, check-ins from different camps, how teams are looking, what the vibe is at certain places. I will be at Chargers camp for a couple days, during that stretch. So we're going to be coming to you 3 days a week during all of training camp. And I'm very much looking forward to it. I'm ready for actual things to start happening that we can start talking about.
Oh, it's been so nice getting like back to normal and like seeing fans at like the Olympics and like even the college softball tournament. Like that was so much fun for me.
I reached out to the Chargers yesterday, and one of their PR guys who I've known for years responded. He's like, it's going to be pretty much business as usual for us. Like you'll be able to talk to players and everything else. I was like, I can't even tell you how amazing that email is. Like it's just so nice to hear because I love going to Chargers camp. It's one of my favorite places because I used to live in LA. So I used to go all the time. And, I got to know those guys a little bit, and I, pretty much would talk to Philip every single year, at least once. And, I've gotten to know Keenan Allen a little bit, and just, it's a really good place. I've had a lot of excellent football conversations. So the idea of getting to go back and do that with a staff that I find really interesting and a situation that I find really interesting, I can't wait to be back in Costa Mesa. It just feels like it's been forever since we've gotten a chance to do that kind of stuff.
It really has, man. It really has. Well, Robert, this has been great, man. Chargers fans, make sure and give him a follow. Check out the Athletic Football Podcast, one of the best in the business, and just, great all around dude. So, Robert, thank you very much, and we'll talk to you soon.
No problem, guys. Appreciate the time.